Story 1. I had been sitting at my desk for what felt like hours, absorbed in a stack of old files, the weight of paperwork pressing on me like the silence in the dim room. The only light came from a flickering desk lamp, its glow casting long, distorted shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. My desk was cluttered with forgotten papers and half-finished tasks, and the drawer had been begging for attention for weeks. Today, however, I was determined to clean it out, to rid myself of the accumulated chaos. As I slid the drawer open, my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. Tucked into the far corner, almost as if placed deliberately, was a small, folded piece of paper. My heart skipped a beat, and an uneasy chill prickled my skin as I pulled it out. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges worn and frayed, as if it had been sitting there for a long time, hidden, forgotten. There was something off about it, something almost waiting. My hand trembled as I unfolded the paper, the musty scent of old paper mingling with the cold air around me. The words written on it were bold and blocky, crude in their simplicity, "We're coming for you." The message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the stomach. My heart raced, and a wave of dread swept over me, so powerful I could almost feel it in the marrow of my bones. Who had written this? And why had it been placed in my desk drawer, like a secret someone wanted me to find? The questions buzzed in my mind, but the answers felt just beyond my reach. I stared at the paper for what seemed like an eternity, the room around me growing stiller by the second. My gaze flickered nervously toward the door, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching me, but there was nothing. Only silence. I set the paper down on my desk and leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of what I had found. There was no explanation. No context. Just those three chilling words, staring up at me. I couldn't help but feel trapped in that moment. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had no enemies. No reason to believe anyone would want to hurt me. At least, none that I knew of. And yet, the unease gnawed at me. Why had this message appeared now? Hidden in my desk, left for me to find. I grabbed my phone, desperately trying to find something, anything, that could explain this. Maybe it was a prank, maybe just a cruel joke. But as I scrolled through my messages and emails, I found nothing out of the ordinary. No strange calls, no warnings. I called a couple of friends, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched, but they were all busy. The buzzing in my ears, the pounding of my heart, drowned out any words of comfort they offered. I hung up the phone and returned to my desk, my eyes inevitably drawn back to the paper. The words still sat there, unchanged. "We're coming for you." The longer I stared at them, the more personal they felt, as if whoever had written them knew exactly who I was, where I lived, and had somehow been watching me for longer than I could understand. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest, and began pacing around the room. Was I overreacting? Was this just a prank, a cruel joke meant to unsettle me? But deep down, I knew it wasn't a joke. It wasn't funny, and it wasn't something I could just ignore. The message felt too real. Too direct. A warning, not a jest. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls growing tighter with every breath I took. The words echoed in my head, louder now. "We're coming for you." My skin crawled as I tried to push the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow, refusing to be banished. I grabbed my phone again, my fingers shaky as I searched for any sign that I wasn't alone in this. Perhaps someone had left the paper there as a joke. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a joke. This was something far darker. I sat back down at my desk, the weight of the paper too much to ignore. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, the silence around me suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound from outside, made my skin prickle with unease. I checked the locks on my doors and windows, certain that I must have missed something. But they were secure. Just as I had left them. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. It gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, refusing to be ignored. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house around me. It was too quiet, too still. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, suffocating. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words again, "We're coming for you," written in thick, blocky letters. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I went to work as usual, hoping that the dread would fade. But something felt different. The air was heavier, thicker. The people around me seemed more distant, their faces blurred and unreadable. When I returned home that evening, I went straight to my desk drawer. The paper was gone. My heart froze in my chest as panic surged through me. Who had taken it? Had someone been in my house? I searched the room, my mind spinning with the horrifying possibility that someone had been watching me, waiting for me to find that note. I checked the locks again, and they were all secure. Just as I had left them. But that didn't make me feel any better. The dread remained, a constant presence in the back of my mind. It was always there, creeping, never truly leaving. Days passed, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking for signs that someone was following me, watching me, but nothing happened. Life went on. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That whatever this was, whoever had left that note, wasn't finished with me yet. And then, one evening, as I was walking to my car after work, I noticed something. A small piece of paper stuck to the windshield. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled it off, my hands trembling. I read the words written on it, "Closer than you think." My blood ran cold. The message wasn't over. They were still watching. And they were closer than I could ever imagine. Story 2. The familiar hum of the kitchen filled the air as I moved about, preparing dinner. The low light cast long shadows across the counters, and the gentle clink of utensils was the only sound in the otherwise peaceful room. As I reached into the drawer for a spoon, something caught my eye, a set of keys sitting in the far corner, gleaming under the dim light. I froze, my hand hovering in the air. They weren't mine. I had never seen them before, nor did they belong to anyone in my household. I picked them up, turning them over in my hand. 3 identical keys, attached to a worn keychain, with no distinguishing features. No labels, no markings. Just the keys, cold and heavy in my palm. A strange sense of unease settled in my chest, like a sudden chill running through my veins. I hadn't placed them there, and no one else had access to my kitchen. How could they have ended up in the drawer? I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps someone had accidentally left them behind. Maybe I had forgotten about them. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no memory of ever seeing these keys before, let alone using them. My heart started to race as an unsettling thought crept into my mind. What if these keys weren't just forgotten objects, but something far darker? Something connected to something I couldn't remember. I walked through the house, checking every door and lock. I tried them on the back door, the garage, and even the small storage shed in the yard. But none of them fit. My confusion deepened. What were these keys for? Why did they seem so familiar, yet so foreign at the same time? They felt like they belonged to something important, something that was just out of reach. I thought about the shed outside. Maybe I had missed something, something hidden, something long forgotten. But no, the keys didn't fit the shed door, nor any other doors I tried. I went back to the kitchen, my mind whirling, a sense of dread growing with each passing moment. I placed the keys back in the drawer, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort clawing at my chest. But even as I closed the drawer, I couldn't stop thinking about them. They felt wrong. The way they had appeared, the way they seemed to belong to something just beyond my grasp, it was all too strange. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those keys. Their gleaming metal staring back at me, as if they were calling to me. I tried to distract myself, tried to ignore the thought that kept gnawing at the back of my mind. Why had they appeared in my kitchen? Was I meant to find them? What were they for? The next morning, unable to shake the feeling that I was missing something, I decided to take the keys to a local locksmith. The man eyed them curiously as he ran them through his hands. "These are strange," he said, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I've never seen keys like these before, but they look like they could be for an old building. Something that hasn't been used in a long time." My heart skipped a beat. An old building? My mind raced. Could these keys be connected to something from my past? But I couldn't remember any old buildings, no place that would require these keys. The locksmith's words only deepened the mystery. What was going on? Why couldn't I remember? I returned home that afternoon, the keys still heavy in my pocket. The feeling of being drawn to something I needed to find, consumed me. I spent hours searching the house again, hoping to find some clue, some hidden compartment that could explain the keys. But I found nothing. It was as though the keys had no purpose, no explanation. It was just a riddle with no answer. I was losing my grip on reality, my mind clouded by frustration and confusion. Then, one night, it hit me. A memory, long buried, resurfaced in my mind. I remembered an old house I used to visit as a child, a place I hadn't thought about in years. It was abandoned now, the windows boarded up, but I had spent many afternoons playing near it, exploring the overgrown yard. I didn't know why, but in that moment, everything clicked. Those keys, those strange, familiar keys, had to be for that house. I couldn't explain it, but it made sense. The old house was the only place I had ever seen doors that might require such keys. I had to go there. I had to find out if these keys opened something in that house. Without thinking, I grabbed the keys and drove to the house. The journey felt surreal, like I was following some invisible force guiding me back to this place from my past. When I arrived, the house stood silent, just as I remember. The yard was overgrown, the windows dark and empty. I walked up to the front door, keys in hand, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried the first key. It didn't fit. I tried the second. No luck. But when I tried the third key, the door creaked open as if the house itself had been waiting for me. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old wood filled my nostrils. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I ventured further in, each step taking me deeper into the forgotten past. It felt like stepping into another time, a place I had buried deep in my memory but was now somehow drawn to. I explored the house, each room more unsettling than the last. But it wasn't until I reached the basement that I found what I was looking for. In the corner of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs, was a small wooden chest. I knew, without a doubt, that this was what the keys were for. With trembling hands, I opened the chest. Inside were old letters, papers, and photographs. As I sifted through them, my breath caught in my throat. There, among the yellowed pages, was a photograph of me, much younger, standing in front of the very house I was now standing in. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This house. This place. It was part of my past. A past I had forgotten, buried so deep in my memory that I had no recollection of it. Story 3. I had just wrapped up another long day at work, the exhaustion weighing heavily on my shoulders as I sank into the couch, eager to unwind. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The kind of quiet that, at times, feels oppressive, almost as though the silence itself is watching you. I thought about how nice it would be to finally let my mind rest, but as I sat there, trying to shake off the day, something caught my eye. Through the window, just beyond the yard, there was a figure. It was hard to make out any distinct features, but it was unmistakable, a person standing still in the shadows. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. A chill crawled up my spine, a prickling sensation creeping under my skin, my instinct screaming that something was wrong. I stared at the figure. The longer I watched, the more unsettling it became. The shape stood motionless, almost as if it were waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for me to notice. My mind raced. Was it a neighbor? Someone passing by? But no, this figure wasn't moving, not even an inch. It remained utterly still, its outline blending with the darkening evening. The silence around me grew heavier, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could almost hear my pulse in my ears. I tried to reason with myself, tried to justify what I was seeing. Maybe it was just someone standing out there, lost in thought, waiting for someone, or maybe it was just a trick of the light, casting shadows that fooled the eyes. But as I continued to stare, my discomfort deepened. The figure felt deliberate, too deliberate. Something about it was not right. I had to know. I couldn't just sit there, my thoughts spiraling, filling with more and more paranoia. My body was moving before my mind even processed it. I grabbed my jacket, my hands trembling as I opened the door. The cool night air rushed at me, hitting my face with a sharpness that matched the fear now coursing through me. I stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the darkness, searching for any sign of the figure, but there was nothing. The yard, as far as I could see, was completely empty. The shadows loomed, but no one stood within them. Confusion gripped me. I had seen it. I was sure of it. But now, there was nothing but the rustling of trees, the wind whispering secrets in the dark. I stepped further into the yard, my breath coming in shallow gasps, scanning every inch for movement, for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No footprints in the grass. No disturbance. It was as though the figure had never been there at all. I felt a creeping unease tighten in my chest, my body stiff with tension as I backed up toward the door. What was happening? Had I imagined it? But it didn't feel like a hallucination. It had been too real. The fear was too intense, too vivid, to dismiss. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it had all been a trick of the mind, something the stress of the day had conjured. I tried to reason with myself. But the feeling of unease refused to leave. Every time I glanced at the window, I half expected to see that figure again, standing there, watching me from the shadows. The house felt colder as the night wore on, the air thick and heavy, as though something unseen was lurking just out of view. Strange noises began to creep through the stillness, creaks in the walls, whispers too faint to catch, but always just there, brushing the edge of my hearing. The house no longer felt like my sanctuary, but a place where something was watching, something was waiting. Sleep was elusive that night. My mind spun with unanswered questions. What had I seen? Who was that figure, and why had they been standing there in the yard, staring into my home? Why had they disappeared as soon as I opened the door? The next morning, I woke up groggy, the events of the previous night still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I decided to step outside and inspect the yard once more. Maybe there would be something, a clue, a sign, that would make sense of it all. But as I stepped onto the porch, everything seemed normal. The grass was undisturbed. The ground was dry. There was no evidence that anything had been there the night before. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the quiet yard, feeling foolish. Maybe it had all been a figment of my imagination after all. But that sense of being watched, it lingered. Even as the days passed and I tried to push the memory to the back of my mind, every now and then, when I looked out the window or stepped into the yard, that feeling would return, subtle at first, but growing stronger, a weight in my chest, as if I were being observed by something, or someone, unseen. Weeks went by, but the memory of that night never truly left me. I couldn't forget the figure, nor the eerie sense that something had been there, watching me. I began to wonder if I'd ever truly know what happened that night, or if it was something I would never be able to explain. But one thing was for certain, I would never look out into my backyard the same way again. Something was out there. And it wasn't done watching me. Story 4. It was late, far later than I usually stayed up, when I found myself at my desk, scrolling mindlessly through my inbox. The quiet hum of my computer filled the room, and the glow of the screen was the only light that surrounded me. That's when something caught my eye. A strange email subject line, one that sent a cold shiver down my spine. My name appeared in it, in the most unsettling way. The tight knot of unease that formed in my stomach was instant, and I couldn't quite understand why. My fingers hesitated over the mouse for a moment before I clicked it open. At first, I thought it might be just another spam message, one of the countless unsolicited advertisements I'd gotten used to ignoring. But as soon as the email loaded, my stomach twisted into knots. Attached to the message was a document. Its file name, my full name, was emblazoned in bold, and the strange, nagging feeling deepened. I opened it cautiously, expecting to see something harmless or perhaps irrelevant, but what I found instead was a formal contract. I stared at the document, unsure of what I was seeing. It looked real, too real. The legal jargon spilled across the pages, terms and conditions that made no sense to me. And there, at the bottom, was my name, neatly signed. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't recognize the signature. I couldn't remember ever agreeing to anything like this. How had this contract come into existence with my name on it? I scanned through it again, my heart racing now. The details described some sort of service I supposedly had signed up for, a service I'd never heard of, never even considered. The fee attached was hefty, an amount I couldn't possibly have agreed to. The whole thing felt wrong. My mind scrambled for any explanation. Maybe I'd accidentally signed up for something, clicked on the wrong link, or forgotten about it in some sleep-deprived haze. But that didn't make sense. I was always so cautious with my online activity, so careful not to fall for scams or click on phishing links. Yet here it was, my name, my signature, and a clear agreement for a service I didn't recall. I immediately checked the sender's email address, hoping for some clue, some sign that this was a mistake. But the email appeared professional, legitimate even. It didn't look like spam or a phishing attempt. I felt my anxiety spike. Could someone have gained access to my information? Had my personal details been compromised somehow? I leaned back in my chair, my thoughts racing. I had to figure this out. I checked my inbox for any prior communication from this address. There was nothing. No previous messages, no hints that this service had ever existed. It was as if the email, and the contract, had appeared out of nowhere, as though they had been waiting for me, knowing I would open it. But there was something else that nagged at me. Something more insidious. The more I stared at the contract, the more real it felt. It wasn't a mistake or a glitch. It was intentional. I knew that much. Someone had crafted this document meticulously, and I was being drawn into something I had no memory of agreeing to. But why? What did they want from me? The night dragged on, and the unease in my chest grew with every passing minute. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I even checked my bank account, hoping to find some sign of an unauthorized transaction. There was nothing. No charges, no withdrawals, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. But the contract remained in my inbox, a ghost that wouldn't leave me alone. I checked my social media accounts, my online profiles, anything that could give me a clue about how they had gotten my name. Everything was secure. I hadn't clicked on anything suspicious. Yet, this contract with my signature, my name, and a service I didn't recognize was right there in front of me. I was certain I hadn't agreed to it. But if not, how could it exist? Was I losing my mind? The next morning, I called a friend, desperate for clarity. I told them about the email, hoping for some rational explanation. They tried to reassure me, suggesting it was probably a simple mistake or a harmless error. But I wasn't convinced. The document felt too precise, too intentional. It was as if someone had been watching me, waiting for this moment. My friend suggested I report the email to my provider or a fraud prevention service. But what if it was too late? What if they already had everything they needed on me? Reluctantly, I forwarded the email to my provider, asking for advice. But as I hit send, a sense of dread washed over me. It felt like I was already too deep in it. The days dragged by, and I waited. I waited for a response, for some kind of update. But nothing came. No follow-up emails, no explanations. My anxiety continued to climb. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the contract, my name at the bottom, staring back at me. I couldn't escape it. The feeling of being trapped, of being watched, never left me. Then, one evening, as I sat staring at my screen, another email popped up in my inbox. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it. The subject line was simple, "It's not over yet." I clicked the email open with trembling hands. There was no document this time, just those 3 words. My heart sank in my chest. And then, beneath the text, there was a photo. A picture of me, sitting at my desk, staring at the screen. The realization hit me like a cold slap, someone had been watching me. They had been there the whole time. Story 5. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside felt distant and the air in the apartment was thick with silence. I was curled up on my couch, scrolling through my phone, trying to unwind after the weight of the day. The soft glow of the screen illuminated the dim room when a message suddenly popped up. The unexpected brightness made me pause, and my eyes narrowed at the unfamiliar number that flashed on the screen. I didn't recognize it. No recent contact, no memory of sharing my number with anyone new. The unease settled in quickly. My heart began to race before I even opened the message. Something about it, something in the pit of my stomach, told me this would not be just another ordinary text. I tapped the screen, and the message unfolded before me. The words were chilling in their simplicity, "You're being watched." At first, it didn't make sense. I stared at the text, trying to grasp its meaning, but all I could do was try to make sense of the situation. Who would send such a thing? The number was completely unfamiliar. I couldn't think of a single person who would ever say something so terrifying without cause. I glanced at the clock, late, but not unbearably so, and looked out the window. The street below was eerily calm, no one around. The only movement was a few cars passing by in the distance. But as I looked out, my pulse quickened. The world seemed to grow unnervingly still. A shiver ran down my spine as I began scanning the room, checking corners and windows as though expecting someone to step out of the shadows and into the light. My mind raced. Was this a prank? Probably. But why did it feel like the message had weight behind it? Why couldn't I shake the feeling that I was not alone? I stood and walked over to the window, peering through the blinds. The street was still empty. No one stood across from my apartment, no one seemed to be watching. It could easily be a prank, I told myself. But a voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't. That it was something else. Something darker. I returned to the couch, trying to ignore the unease that seemed to settle deep in my chest. But the thought of being watched gnawed at me relentlessly. I had no enemies, none that I knew of, and certainly no one who would have any reason to stalk me. But the longer I thought about it, the more it felt real, like someone had been following me for days, watching my every move without me ever noticing. The thought made my skin crawl. Anxiously, I typed a reply, asking, "Who is this?" But no response came. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my fingers trembling on the phone, but the silence stretched on. The waiting, the uncertainty, it was suffocating. Then, the screen flickered and buzzed again. My stomach lurched as I opened the new message. "You think you're alone, but you're not. I've been watching you for days." My heart dropped into my stomach. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some harmless prank. Someone had been watching me, studying me, without me knowing. I glanced around the room once more, this time with frantic eyes, scanning the corners, every nook and cranny, desperate to catch a glimpse of whoever had been hiding in the shadows. But there was no one. Not a soul. I grabbed my phone, my mind racing, and tried to block the number, but before I could, the screen went black. It was as though someone was controlling my phone, forcing it into submission. Panic gripped me. The apartment felt colder. The silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive. I could hear the quickening beat of my own heart, the rush of blood in my ears. I stumbled toward the front door, checking the lock, checking everything. The windows were shut tight. I forced myself to breathe, but the feeling that someone was out there, somewhere, watching me, made my stomach churn. Whoever was behind this knew where I was, knew what I was doing. They knew how to reach me. A thought flashed in my mind, should I call the police? It seemed too trivial. A message. A text. A simple message that could easily be written off as nothing. But the feeling of being watched. That wasn't something you could ignore. That wasn't something you could brush off. I grabbed my phone once more, desperately trying to send a message to a close friend, asking if they could come over. But the message wouldn't send. Every attempt, every tap, was blocked. My phone felt like it was being controlled from somewhere else. Then the next message arrived. I'm right outside your door. My breath caught in my throat. Cold seeped into my bones. I froze. What do I do now? I was alone. Isolated. And terrified. The words echoed in my mind, but I couldn't shake the image of the door. The thought that someone was right on the other side, waiting for me to make a move. I moved, slowly at first, unable to control the heavy, dragging sensation in my limbs. My legs felt like lead, but I had to know. I had to see. I peered through the peephole. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a thunderous sound in my ears. Nothing. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I opened the door slowly, my hand trembling on the handle. The silence was deafening. Nothing but the quiet emptiness on the other side. No footsteps. No sounds. I stepped back inside, my heart still racing. The message hung in the air. Whoever had been watching me, whoever was behind these texts, was close. I knew it. They were out there. Somewhere. Waiting for me to make a move. The sensation of being watched never left me. It clung to me like a cold presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting. And as I stood there, in the oppressive silence of my apartment, I realized something far more terrifying than the thought of being watched. Whoever had been sending these messages. That was only the beginning. Story 6. I woke up that morning to a quiet stillness, the kind that only early mornings can bring. The sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, casting a gentle glow across the bathroom tiles, giving the room a serene, almost peaceful atmosphere. But something about the reflection in the mirror caught my attention and sent a chill creeping down my spine. The mirror, usually pristine and flawless, was marred by a jagged crack that ran across its surface, splitting from the center and stretching outward in a way that seemed deliberate, not accidental. It wasn't the kind of crack caused by a fall or an impact, it almost looked as if it had been carefully planned. I hadn't noticed the crack the night before when I had gone to bed, and the thought of it having appeared overnight filled me with an uneasy sensation. I stood frozen before it, staring at the fractured glass. The crack was almost too perfect, too precise. My stomach churned as I realized I hadn't even been near the mirror, let alone touched it. How could it have cracked like that, perfectly splitting in a way that seemed intentional? I blinked and shook my head, trying to shake off the nagging thought that perhaps I was imagining things. Maybe the mirror had been slowly deteriorating over time, and I hadn't noticed the growing crack until now. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The feeling of something being wrong settled heavily in my chest. The reflection in the mirror, too, felt off. It wasn't just the crack, it was something in the image itself. I swore for a brief moment, I saw something else in the reflection, something that wasn't me. A fleeting glimpse of something unfamiliar, standing where I stood. I stepped back, shaking my head in disbelief, but when I looked again, it was gone, replaced by my own image, just as it should be. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light, or some strange anomaly with the glass. But the unease in my stomach only grew stronger. Something wasn't right. I cautiously reached out, my fingers hovering just above the crack. The way the light caught the edges of it made the glass shimmer in an unsettling way, almost as if the mirror was alive, reacting to my touch. I jerked my hand back, my pulse quickening. A wave of dread washed over me, thickening the air around me, and I swear I heard something, a faint whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. But the whisper grew louder, clearer, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. It came from the direction of the mirror, beckoning me. "Turn around," the voice whispered, almost too quiet to hear, but there, nonetheless. I quickly turned away, heart pounding, but the bathroom was empty. No one was there. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. Instinctively, I grabbed my phone, feeling a strange compulsion to document the crack, to prove that it had been there, that I hadn't imagined it. I snapped a picture of the mirror, my hands shaking as I reviewed the image. But what I saw in the photo made my blood run cold. The crack in the mirror seemed even worse, wider, deeper, and the reflection showed something else. A shadowy figure, standing just behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the photo, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. There was no one behind me when I took the picture. No one. Panic set in as I zoomed in on the figure in the reflection. It was blurry, its features distorted, but there was no mistaking the shape. Tall, thin, and vaguely human. My hands trembled as I lowered the phone, glancing back at the mirror. The figure was gone, but the crack remained, pulsing as if it were alive, drawing me in. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. Every time I looked at the mirror, it felt as though something was calling to me from the other side, a presence, a feeling that wasn't mine. The bathroom, usually a quiet, peaceful space, now felt oppressive, the air heavy and suffocating. I left the room quickly, shutting the door behind me, but the unease didn't fade. It followed me into the kitchen, into the living room, into every corner of the apartment. The bathroom wasn't just a bathroom anymore. The mirror wasn't just a mirror. I stayed away from it for the rest of the day, unable to shake the sense of dread that lingered in the air. Every time I looked at the bathroom door, I could almost hear the whisper again, urging me to look. The feeling was too strong to ignore. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness of the apartment pressing in on me, I heard it again. The whisper. Too faint to make out, but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the bathroom. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest, and stared at the bathroom door. The air around me had grown thick, heavier than before, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something in that bathroom wasn't right, and I had to see it for myself. I got out of bed and walked toward the bathroom, my feet making no sound on the floor. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned it. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The cold air from the bathroom hit me immediately, sending a shiver down my spine. The mirror was still cracked, the jagged lines stretching across its surface. But this time, something was different. The figure, the one I had seen in the photo, was there again. It wasn't a blur this time. It was clear. The figure stood just behind me, its face distorted, its eyes hollow and dark. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whisper came again, louder now, filling the room with its chilling presence. You shouldn't have looked. In that moment, I knew the mirror wasn't just a reflection of what was in front of it. It was a doorway, one that I had unwittingly opened. And whatever had been waiting on the other side had been waiting for me to look. Story 7. I had been cleaning out my drawer when something caught my eye, a small, tarnished piece of jewelry, wedged between old receipts and forgotten trinkets. I didn't remember buying it. In fact, I didn't remember seeing it at all. The pendant was delicate, a simple silver necklace with a smooth, round charm that gleamed faintly despite the years of neglect. I turned it over in my hands, examining it from every angle, trying to recall if it had ever belonged to me. The engraving on the back stopped me cold, my initials, JB, etched in elegant script. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was personal. But I couldn't place how it had come into my possession. My heart skipped a beat as I traced the smooth surface of the pendant. How had it ended up in my drawer? I had no memory of buying it, no memory of receiving it as a gift, or even of anyone giving it to me. It felt like something I should have remembered, something that would stand out. But there were no clues, no tags, no explanation. The longer I held it, the more uneasy I became. Why did it feel like a part of me? And yet, it was a part one couldn't recall ever having. Confusion and dread washed over me. My mind spun, trying to grasp onto anything that would explain how this piece of jewelry had found its way into my life. I thought back to the past few weeks, searching my memory for any encounter or person who might have given it to me. Family, friends, co-workers. But no one came to mind. There was no one who would have bought me a pendant like this, no one who would have gifted it without reason or without me knowing. Still, there was something about the pendant that felt familiar. Not in a way I could explain, but in a way that tugged at the edges of my mind, like a distant memory on the edge of recall. I set the pendant back in the drawer, but the feeling in my gut told me I shouldn't leave it behind. It felt like something was pulling me to keep it, like I couldn't let it go, like I needed to carry it with me. That night, as I lay in bed, the thought of the pendant wouldn't leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it, feel it, the cool, smooth metal against my skin, a weight pressing against me even in my sleep. I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, persistent and heavy. The next morning, I returned to the drawer to check on it. To my horror, it was gone. My breath caught in my throat as I tore through the drawer, pulling out papers, receipts, anything that could explain where it had gone. But it wasn't there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, my heart racing. I could have sworn I left it there. It was the last thing I remembered before going to sleep. But now, it was gone, vanished without a trace. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, maybe I'd misplaced it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Nothing made sense. That night, I received a message. It was short, but it froze the blood in my veins. "You didn't keep it, did you?" I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. How could anyone know about the pendant? I hadn't told anyone about it. No one knew I had found it. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, gnawing at my mind. How could anyone have known? I didn't respond. I couldn't bring myself to. But the unease, the weight of the unknown, grew stronger. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic searching. I checked every corner of the house, every drawer, every shelf, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for where the pendant had gone. I even went back to the jewelry store where I usually bought my pieces, but no one could help. No answers came. It felt like I was being trapped in a mystery with no way out. Then, a week later, I saw it. I was walking through the park when something caught my eye, something half buried in the dirt. A small object. I knelt down, hands trembling as I picked it up. It was the pendant. Exactly the same, tarnished, old, and with my initials engraved on the back. But there was something new. Beneath my initials was a date. A date I didn't recognize, but one that felt eerily familiar. A date that was only a few weeks before I had found it in my drawer. I didn't know what to do. It was the same pendant, but how had it ended up in the park? How had it disappeared from my drawer only to reappear on the ground, as though it had been waiting for me to find it? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. Only more questions. That night, as I sat in my living room, holding the pendant tightly in my hand, I felt it again, a presence. The weight in the room grew heavier, as if something, or someone, was there with me, watching. I looked around, breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling lingered, suffocating, as if something was just out of reach, pulling the strings from the shadows. I knew, then, that I wasn't alone. Whoever, or whatever, was behind this, was watching me, guiding me, leading me down a path I didn't want to follow. The pendant was just the beginning. Story 8. It was the kind of night where the world felt completely still, the quiet seeping into the very walls of my home. I had just fallen into a light sleep when I was suddenly jolted awake by a sound that cut through the silence, a knock. At first, it was faint, almost like the soft tapping of fingers against wood. But as the seconds ticked by, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. The sound reverberated through the stillness of the house, each tap echoing in the heavy air. I glanced at the clock, 2:17 a.m. My heart skipped a beat. What was happening? Who would be at my door at this hour? I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The knocks continued, growing more rhythmic, more urgent. There was no mistaking it now, someone, or something, was knocking at my door in the dead of night. I wasn't expecting anyone. My mind raced through possibilities, a prank? A neighbor in distress? Or maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. Still, the knocks persisted, echoing through the house like a relentless drumbeat. Hesitant, I slid out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor with a quiet thud. The house felt unnaturally quiet, too quiet, as if the outside world had simply ceased to exist. I slowly made my way toward the front door, each step feeling heavier, like the floorboards themselves were holding me back. The knocking grew louder, more forceful, as if demanding my attention. When I reached the door, it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. I froze, standing motionless for a long moment, listening, heart pounding in my chest. No sound. No movement. Just an empty stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I reached for the door handle. There was nothing out there, nothing but the soft glow of the streetlight illuminating the porch, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find someone standing there, someone who could explain the strange knocking. But the porch was empty. I stepped outside, my pulse racing, scanning the surroundings with frantic eyes. There were no footprints in the dew-covered grass, no signs of life anywhere. The yard was still, the air heavy with the kind of silence that presses in on you, like the world has forgotten how to make noise. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe a tree branch had tapped against the door in an odd way. But no. There was no breeze, no movement, not even a rustle in the trees. Everything was perfectly still. My breath hung in the cold air, and a sense of unease crept up my spine. I glanced back at the door, my eyes flicking nervously to the shadows near the porch. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that something was lurking just out of sight, watching. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, but the unease lingered. I stood there, back pressed against the door, hoping that would somehow keep whatever was out there away. I listened. The silence returned, but it was thick, oppressive, suffocating. I turned off the lights and crawled back into bed, trying to convince myself that it had all been a strange coincidence, just a tired mind playing tricks. But the fear still gnawed at me. The knocking wasn't random. It felt deliberate, as if it had been meant to draw my attention. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Lying in the darkness, I could hear nothing but the quiet hum of the house, the soft creaks of wood settling. And then, just when I thought I might drift off to sleep, I heard it. The faintest scrape. So soft I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it, but then it came again. Louder. A slow, deliberate scraping sound, like someone, was trying to get in. My heart stopped. I sat up quickly, my breath catching in my throat. The scraping was coming from the door. I froze, fear flooding my veins. The knocking had stopped, replaced by this unsettling sound that made my skin crawl. I slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and tiptoed to the door. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking as I touched it. The moment my fingers brushed the cold metal, the scraping stopped. I held my breath, waiting, my hand still on the handle. Nothing. The house was as still as it had been before. I turned the handle slowly, cautiously, and opened the door just a crack. The porch was empty. Again. I stepped outside again, more cautiously this time, scanning the yard, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone. No indication that anything unusual had happened. I closed the door and locked it again, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. Who had knocked? Who had left without a trace? Why had the knocking stopped when I opened the door? The fear refused to leave me. It clung to me like a cold, suffocating fog, pressing against my chest as I made my way back to bed. But sleep didn't come. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air kept me on edge. I lay there, wide awake, staring into the darkness, listening for another knock, another sound that would tell me I wasn't alone. The minutes dragged by, each one longer than the last, and my mind refused to settle. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, and I drifted into a restless sleep, the fear still gnawing at me. When I woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal. The house was still locked. There was no sign of anything unusual. But deep down, I knew something had happened that night. The knocking, the scraping, the feeling of being watched, it had all happened. And though the night had ended, the unease remained, lurking in the back of my mind. As the days went by, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. A product of stress, maybe, or exhaustion. But every time I passed that door, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting. Waiting for me to open it again. The knocking had stopped, but the fear never left. And I couldn't help but wonder, what was out there? Was it still waiting for me, just beyond the door, biding its time until I made the wrong move? Story 9. The note caught my eye at first, innocently lying on the table, as though it had always been there. It was a crumpled, faded scrap of paper, the words hastily scrawled, "I'm still here, just waiting." A simple phrase, yet it sent a ripple of unease through me. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at it, as if the very act of reading it might bring whatever presence had written it closer. The air in my apartment felt suddenly too thick, as if the walls were leaning in, pressing against me. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up, the paper cold against my skin. There was no indication of who had left it, or how long it had been there. The silence around me seemed to deepen, suffocating, and I began to wonder how something so small could make such a huge impact on my heart, making it race as though the very words had brought with them a presence. I glanced around, expecting to see some explanation, some sign that I had missed something. Had I forgotten someone coming by? No. The apartment was as I had left it, empty. No one had been here. And yet, there was this note, directed at me, or perhaps at someone else. But it felt personal. The kind of message that was meant for me alone, written with a raw urgency that made my stomach twist in discomfort. I stood up and walked to the window, trying to shake off the growing unease that clung to me like a second skin. Outside, the street was calm, eerily so. There was no sign of anyone, no movement. The silence that filled the air felt like it was pressing in from every corner of the world. I turned back to the note, half expecting it to vanish, but it was still there, crumpled in my hand. But now, something had changed. The words on the paper weren't as clear as they had been just moments ago. They had blurred, smudged, as if the ink was bleeding away, as if it were melting right before my eyes. A creeping sense of dread settled in my chest, and I quickly dropped the note to the floor. My breath came in shallow, quick bursts as my heart pounded with rising panic. The room, once familiar and safe, now felt foreign, oppressive. I stepped back, my eyes darting nervously from corner to corner. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, each shadow growing deeper, darker. My body screamed to leave, to flee, but my legs were frozen in place. A terrible realization slowly crept over me, I was no longer alone. I reached for my things, my hands moving mechanically, but before I could make it to the door, I heard it. A whisper. Barely audible over the pounding of my heart, yet unmistakable, "I'm still here." The words slipped through the air like a cool breeze, curling around me, drawing closer. I stood frozen, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was faint, but it grew clearer, more distinct, as if someone was standing just outside the door. My eyes locked on the door, my body stiff with fear, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the handle, to open it, to face whatever was on the other side. The voice repeated, soft but unmistakable. "I'm still here." It came from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the very air I breathed. The words echoed in my mind, growing louder, and I stumbled back, my legs giving way beneath me. The sensation of something, someone, watching me, waiting for me, grew unbearable. It was as if the very room itself had turned against me. I curled into a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible, my arms wrapped around my knees. The note was still there, lying forgotten on the floor, its meaning sinking in like a stone in my chest. "I'm still here." The voice was now almost a growl, its presence nearly tangible, as if it was stepping out of the shadows, inch by inch. The air around me thickened, turned cold. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my chest. The figure, it was here. It had always been here. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by a terror that turned my body to stone. My mind screamed for me to wake up, to snap out of this nightmare, but there was no escape. The darkness in the room seemed to stretch, to expand, and then the door creaked open. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure emerged, its shape flickering like smoke, shifting in and out of focus. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel the coldness radiating from it, the darkness that seemed to bleed from its very being. "I'm still here." The voice, cold and familiar, laced with something darker, something more sinister, sent a shiver down my spine. The figure stepped closer, its form still formless, its face a blur, but somehow I could feel it, their eyes, staring into mine, pulling at the very core of my being. The words were a taunt, a reminder that I had never truly been alone. "You've always known I was here," it whispered, its voice barely a breath. "You just didn't want to believe it." I closed my eyes, desperate to escape, to wake from the nightmare, but when I opened them again, the figure was right in front of me, its breath cold on my skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The room seemed to tilt, the walls bending in on me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room was empty, silent once more. But the weight of its presence remained. The note on the floor, the words etched into my memory, "I'm still here, just waiting," clung to me like a shadow, a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. Had it ended? Or had I only just begun to understand the truth of what had been lurking in the dark, waiting for me to acknowledge it? Story 10. It all began a few days after I moved in. The apartment was peaceful at first, its calm atmosphere welcoming after a hectic move. But that tranquility was shattered every night, without fail, at exactly 3 a.m. At first, I dismissed the strange noise as the building settling, creaks, groans, the usual noises of an old structure, but soon, it became impossible to ignore. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking on the wall that separated my apartment from the one next door. It wasn't a frantic knock, nor a random series of bangs, it was steady, almost as if someone were carefully tapping, waiting for me to hear. The sound reverberated through the silence of the night, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was always there. It felt too precise to be a coincidence. At exactly 3 a.m. each night, the knocking would start, just like clockwork. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just the quirks of old plumbing or a misaligned heating system. But after a few nights of lying awake, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was deliberate, that someone was on the other side of that wall, knocking just to get my attention. The worst part? It didn't seem to bother anyone else. I couldn't tell if the neighbors heard it, or if they were just ignoring it, but it kept me up, wondering who was behind it. One night, after yet another sleepless stretch, I decided to confront it. I had had enough. I got out of bed and walked to the wall, pressing my ear against it, hoping to understand where the knocking was coming from. The tapping continued, steady as ever, but now it sounded closer. More intentional. My pulse quickened, the rhythm of the knock now so loud that it felt as if it was thumping in my chest. I knocked back once, just to see if there would be a response. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. For a moment, I thought the noise had stopped, but then, almost immediately, the knocking resumed. It was as if the person on the other side had been waiting for me to make a move. But something was off. The timing was too perfect. The knocks weren't just random, they were purposeful, measured. The next morning, I called the building manager, hoping for an explanation. I explained the situation, telling them about the knocks, the strange pattern that I couldn't ignore. The manager sounded confused. "No one lives next door," they said. "That apartment's been vacant for months." My stomach dropped. I didn't know how to process what they were telling me. That apartment, the one I'd heard the knocking coming from, had been empty all along. There was no way I could have imagined it. The knocks were too real, too clear. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, trying to convince myself that I had been mistaken. But as the day wore on, and the sun began to set, I knew it was only a matter of time before the knocking started again. I tried to prepare myself, my heart already quickening as the clock neared 3 a.m. The seconds seemed to stretch as I waited, bracing myself. And then, as the clock struck 3 o'clock, the knocking began, just like it had every other night. This time, I wasn't going to just lie there and listen. I grabbed my phone, unsure whether I should record the sound or finally confront whatever was on the other side. But just as I hesitated, the knocking stopped. Dead silence. For a moment, I dared to hope it was over, that it had been some strange mistake. But then, something even more chilling happened. The wall began to shake. It wasn't violent, but it was enough to make the plaster creak, as though someone, was pressing against it from the other side. I stepped back, my heart racing. The room felt smaller, suffocating. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was the wall shaking? What was on the other side? Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the door to the empty apartment slammed open with a force that made me jump. Frozen, I stared at the dark hallway, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But when I turned back to the wall, the knocking started up again, louder this time. More insistent. Without thinking, I bolted from my apartment, desperation pushing me toward the building manager's office. I pounded on the door, frantic. When the manager opened it, they looked at me with confusion. "What's wrong?" they asked, their tone flat, as though they didn't understand the panic in my voice. "The apartment next door," I said, my words rushing out. "There's something in there. Someone's knocking on my wall every night. You have to help me." The manager's frown deepened. "There's no one in that apartment," they replied, their voice slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to make sense of my words. "That apartment has been vacant for months." I could feel the blood drain from my face. "But I've heard it," I wanted to say. "Every night. Someone is knocking. It's like they're trying to get my attention." But the manager just stared at me, their expression blank. They didn't understand. They didn't hear it. After a long pause, they finally said, "I'll look into it." But they never returned with an answer. The knocking didn't stop. In fact, it grew worse. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., the noise would begin again, like a relentless, unyielding rhythm. A warning, maybe. Or something more. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out, leaving behind the unanswered questions. But even now, I still hear the knocking, echoing through the empty spaces of my mind. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if that apartment next door was ever truly empty after all.